Welcome to the Super Art Power Hour. I'm an illustrator and concept artist on TFT Gameplay. For this session, we're going to start off with a concept that's pretty much already done. I did this a little bit earlier, so we're going to cheat a little bit and kind of skip over this. What we're going to be doing is reimagining Alune in Set 14 Cyber City as an Anima Squad member. Woo! So basically what we want to do is we want to take Alune, who's unfortunately not in Set 14 Cyber City. She is my favorite character and I really would like her in there. But we're gonna reimagine her into one of the traits that I think that she would fit best in, which personally for me, I think Anima Squad is like a really, really cool trait. And I always wanted her to be kind of like a battle butterfly, if that makes sense. So we essentially imagined her as battle butterfly Alune. We imagined her with the trait colors, and we essentially want to see how she fits into the gameplay and what role she takes up in the set. Oh, and disclaimer, it's just a hypothetical of what we would do if we were to add Alune into Set 14, but this will probably never be made. Ultimately, she will not be in Set 14. We're gonna take that into a little bit of the journey where it goes from concept into basically a thumbnail, and then we do a little bit more painting into that, and then do it into a green light is what we call it, which is when we get the go to basically say, hey, we're ready to render this. I'm going to try to demystify a little bit of how splash art in TFT differs a little bit from League of Legends and how we use our assets a little bit differently and also what we think through as we make these assets. A lot of this stuff is not normally what we think about when we make art, but it's really important when we're making something for a game. Usually this stuff takes like, I want to say 5 to 6 weeks, depending on the scale of the project. We're going to just take it and expedite the process a little bit so you guys can get a little bit more of an insider look into how this stuff is normally made. Normally when we're trying to create characters, we usually try to look at, like what do we need to fill in a set? Usually gameplay will be like, oh, we need a mage or we might need like a front line. And I think that will kind of dictate a lot of our decisions as we make a character. But for this one, we said, hey, Alune's great, and we're just going to kind of imagine her here. So if she was in Cyber City, this is what I imagine she would look like. So for programs that I'm using here, I'm going to be using PureRef, and that's where I'm going to be gathering all my references. I'm going to be using Clip Studio, which I'm going to do my initial drawing in, and then I'm going to do Photoshop as my final step in the process. And I think that's just because I like Photoshop's power when it comes to painting a little bit more. So I think that there's not necessarily a program that is like a solve all for everything or like a best for everything. It's kind of up to preference here. These are just the programs that I personally use just because these are the ones that I've been using for a while, and these are the ones I feel comfortable with. I think I only started using Clip Studio like very, very recently. I think the important part is that you can literally do these with any program. The program matters a lot less than what you're actually doing with the program. If you're really begging to like find like no, I just need someone to tell me like what to use, I would say that Photoshop is pretty much an industry standard of basically everybody uses it. Every program can convert into a Photoshop file. So I think that's a good starting point to kind of like go off into. But I think a second good choice would be Clip Studio Paint because I think that the power of it is pretty much very similar. So I think the first thing that is probably the most important step in any sort of art making in general is probably collecting reference. Collecting reference is I don't want to say underdog, but it's the true secret to, I think, making like any sort of good piece, whether it's concept or like illustration or key art or anything that you're trying to do. Just because I think that when we're trying to make art, what we're trying to do is we're trying to sell a fantasy or essentially like a fake reality to the audience. And so what I do is I essentially collect like a huge ref board. And I think here what I did was I collected this huge ref board of stuff that I think would inspire me for my piece that I'm going to do here. I obviously have the original concept art that I did here for Alune, which is Battle Butterfly. In comparison to when we're kind of doing things for League, I want to say that when we're making a skin, essentially, we're kind of selling like a new fantasy to a player, right? And it's like, oh, this is an alternate universe for this character. But for TFT, when we're creating a character, we're kind of fitting all of these different skin lines into just one cohesive universe. So for a lot of the skins, what we do is, I think a lot of players will notice as well, we tend to kind of cohesify the color palettes of them a lot. When we look at all the characters like on our boards, we want to make sure that they feel like a team. And so we really wanted to stick with the Anima Squad palette that we dictated for set 14 here, which is beautiful light blues and like pinks. And I thought that was a beautiful palette to go into like maybe something that was like a butterfly and stuff. For a lot of this, I wanted to stay true to like stuff that we knew Alune for, which is her face paint, her collar, her beautiful giant weapon. When we were making this, we essentially were thinking about a bunch of different stuff. It's like, hey, you know, how would she fit in? What would she be kind of doing? We kind of ended up with this very fun, a little bit sexy in a little bit ways, but was still maintaining the elegance and like the stature that Alune kind of has in her original concept. Oh, and I wanted her to be a gardener because I love butterflies and I think they should be part of a garden. So she has garden gloves. Yay! And I think that's really cool. And okay, there's a lot of stuff in this concept that are like cool little nods here. Like her weapon looks like a little bit of like a cocoon or, you know, like a butterfly chrysalis and stuff. I think that we're just gonna move on from that just because I think getting into the design process is something that is gonna be a lot better covered by, I think, someone who dedicates a lot more time into that stuff. So I'm gonna kind of quickly dive into, I think, gathering reference for splash art in particular. So for TFT splash art, this is something that we have to deal with a lot, which is we don't actually have that much real estate. When we kind of look at a League of Legends splash art, right, we have a lot of space for like the player to look in and interact with the entire thing because most of what their experience is I want to say an out of game experience. But when we're looking at TFT gameplay, we're looking at selling this person and their identity through a very, very small space on the screen. And it's also something that they're going to see a lot. So we have to focus really, really hard on that image crop that we call for all the characters. And it's basically like just their face and a little bit of their weapon. And that's our main focus. But we're still going to paint the entire thing because I think that players generally love to see everything as well, even when they're not playing the game. When we're looking at reference for splash art or when we're creating an illustration asset for any sort of game, the first thing that we always think of is finding other illustrations to reference off of and take inspiration from, right? And so the first thing that I did was go through, okay, well, I want to look at some Anima Squad splashes that I think really inspired me as like an illustrator, right? And so I found a lot of the ones that I did that I thought were particularly amazing, and I thought these had like really, really great colors to them and really good compositions to them. And also, I think just showcased a lot of like their character through like their posture and their gesture, right? And so when I was looking through a lot of these, I was like seeing like, oh, hey, Riven looks really good here with like her giant sword. I think that would be like a great thing to like kind of like focus on for her crop and stuff. But I think that that's where we want to start off reference. I think the important stuff is where we go from here, because I don't think that we should ever end reference with just what is already created. Because when we're looking at art, like we're looking at derivative of derivative, right? We're looking at like a reference of a photo, a reference of like a painter and all that stuff. And so I want to find reference of like real world, like inspirations that I think kind of will inspire me for this piece, right? And then so for Alune, I literally went on Pinterest and I said, girl sitting reference. And I literally looked through a bunch of references and I went to kind of see like, oh, like, you know, we have some really like elegant, like little fairy pieces here. Some things that like kind of scream to me like elegant goddess, kind of almost like this queenliness to her. She's kind of like this character that I want to say players really love her for how elegant she is. She's kind of this magical being. She almost feels like not of this world. And I think that like Alune fans especially would agree that she basically literally is not out of it, is not in this world. And so I found a lot of references that would inspire like some sort of posing here. And what I'm doing is I'm trying to figure out like how to mix the real world reference that I have and sort of my illustration references that I have and kind of combine these into something that will inspire me to create a new piece. This is like the main portion, I think, of what actually makes a splash art good, is kind of gathering enough reference that you have a breadth of things to choose from that you can mishmash together as you draw and kind of create something new that's really inspiring to you. Because I think that when we go off of no reference or we're just going for off from our brain, like we're so limited in what we can do. And I think that as much as we would like to stay within our brain library, I think we need to expand so much further outside of our visual library of our brain in order to actually create something new and exciting for players. So I've been at Riot for 3 years. Some favorite projects that I've been on. I'd say Alune is probably my favorite one. She's definitely been one that I think I did, and I got to really see how players got excited about it. And it was like one of the ones where I really felt gratified because I was like, oh wow, like what I do here actually brings a lot of joy to people. And there were a lot of fans of like Aphelios who were fans of him just because they liked Alune as a character. And it was kind of like watching these people's days kind of get made by the fact that like their favorite character finally gets to be playable in some sort of form, right? Very, by the way, small ref board in comparison to what I usually have. I'll usually spend like a day or two gathering just references. And sometimes I think the greatest hack of all is if you can't find a pose reference for like what you want, you can just take it yourself. And I kind of do that a lot. There's literally no reason not to have enough reference. And I think that's a really, really important thing to note. I'm just gonna warm up with some figures here because a mistake that I see a lot of people do, and this is me included, is we'll think that like for the day we just want to like do our work or whatever. And so we'll just draw one thing and that's basically just what we do for work. And I don't know if this is the same for everybody else, but for me, my first drawing every single day sucks. Like it's so bad. Like, and so I think the important part is that when we start off the day, we want to get that bad drawing out of the way. And so it also trains our mind, I think, to readjust, because I think that when we draw something, we think it's the greatest thing ever until we look at it afterwards and we're just like, oh, that's like that like sucks so bad. So I'm gonna just draw some figures real quick. For TFT, I think a really important thing is that we think about how players are going to interact with this primarily, and I think that is in the shop. No, I don't think. I know it is in the shop. And that's basically when players are like clicking through the game and they're going to like be like, you know, I need to buy Alune as a character, right? How do we like completely register the character like to the person in like literally like 0.5 seconds, right? And they're gonna memorize this, they're gonna memorize the color, they're gonna memorize the shape, the palette, and all stuff. But it's important that when we look at like the roster of characters that we have, that she looks unique enough that like she's not gonna blend in with, for example, Aurora. And I think that for this, I'm going to primarily focus on the overall gesture over any like small details that we have in the concept, because I know that I'm gonna get to those later. But I think the important part is that we nail the overall motion of her body first, because that will primarily be what sells to people the believability of this character. For illustration, there's a lot of different ways to solve the problem of like, what am I illustrating? What fantasy am I selling? You know, I think every artist has a different perspective on it. And I kind of want to just iterate real quick that this is just my process of doing it, and it's not necessarily the right process, but it's a process that we use for work, specifically on TFT, that like kind of fits into the pipeline that we can kind of take inspiration from. So I want to say generally with a lot of these sketches, I kind of want to remain really loose with it and not get into too many nitty-gritties, just because I think that right now it's more important to solve overarching issues than it is to solve like nitty-gritty detail issues that we're going to get into later. And so it is important to really ask ourselves the overarching questions of just like, what am I trying to sell? What are players most excited about? What does this say about this character? Is this character recognizable? You know, there's a lot of things that we can think about. What I mean by selling a character is that when somebody looks at them, they're not going to believe that this is like a real character, right? But we want to at least make them sort of imagine themselves in the shoes of this character. We want them to kind of like feel like this is something that they are like projecting themselves into, a story they're projecting themselves into, a character that they're projecting themselves into. We just want them to feel like they are interacting with something that is maybe, you know, a little bit outside of like the realm of believability, because we live in, you know, as much as we want to be in fantastical fantasy land, like we kind of live in reality here, and reality is not as fun, right? And then so when we're trying to sell something to someone, right, we're essentially being like, hey, like imagine this, like it's a different reality where Anima Squad is real and the monsters are here and they're attacking the cyber city and we're making this world around it, right? Normally when we do these, we run through at least like 4 or 5 thumbnails that feel really, really finished. And I think that for this, we're just going to take this initial drawing that I've done, and we're going to kind of focus on like the main crop and kind of take that into a thumbnail stage and then kind of show what we kind of prioritize when we think about creating these like illustrations. So what I'm doing here is I'm kind of taking my rough sketch, and then now I'm going to get into just a little bit more of like the details of it. And it's gonna be pretty rough. I like to work pretty small just so that this stage goes by a little bit faster. Just because I think that when we work really, really big, we see those pixels, our first thought to ourselves is like, oh my God, like I want to like make sure that all looks good, right? But like when we have stuff like that's even like this small, we're going to focus primarily on just making the overall image solved first. And I say solve because like a lot of what we do as artists is actually just like problem solving. Like we're just solving problems over and over and over again. And so I'm just gonna keep thinking in my head as I make this, like, what problem am I trying to solve at this point, you know? Because I think that's a lot less intimidating. So for a thumbnail, I'm going to solve primarily silhouette read and the general like idea and fantasy that we're trying to sell, right? So for Alune, we're trying to sell, number one, she's Anima Squad. Number two, she's a caster. Number three, that she's an elegant, queenly figure. Because we have so little real estate to work with, we want to really make sure that when we're creating a new piece of artwork, we want to utilize that space as effective and, you know, as good as we could possibly can. I think I can't think of a better word to like think of besides good. But we're essentially like given this space, and we kind of need to like be like, okay, well, we should try to fit all the icons of this character into this little frame that we kind of have. And so when I think of Alune, I think that when I originally worked on her version in Spirit Blossom, one thing that we really talked about was like making sure that her cowl is there. And this giant collar that she kind of has is a really big indicator to players that this is like, okay, they're looking at Alune. And I always did thumbnails with her somewhat looking down at us, because I also think that another good indicator of Alune is that like, hey, she always has this out of world, above us experience to her. She's never really like on the same level as anybody else. And I think that's an important distinction to make, because I think that when we paint a character, we really want to understand like who this character is, and how, if you, the player, were transported into the world of Cyber City or Runeterra or wherever the setting is, how you would feel or how you would experience meeting her. And I think that, in my opinion, in any case where you meet Alune, you should kind of think to yourself like, oh, I'm like, she is going to kill me now. Because she's almost this character that is focused on what she wants, and she doesn't really care about other stuff like how do people feel about things. I mean, I think that like she cares about her brother a lot, but for the most part, like she's worried about what the moon is, you know, what the moon's doing, how the moon is. When you get into art, you kind of are spoiled by the fact that like you're just allowed to do whatever you want, you know. You're allowed to just draw pretty girls if you want to draw pretty girls. You're allowed to draw dragons if you want to draw dragons and stuff. But then like you're kind of thrown into this industry where it's like we have specific needs, right? And these needs are a lot of times different from what you want to create as an artist. But you kind of have to fit yourself into that mold and then figure out what inside of that you really care about making. So for example, for me, I had the unfortunate reality where I joined and I was like, okay, I'm so ready to make all these like pretty and cool characters. And after a while, it was like Yordle after Yordle after Yordle. You know, I had to draw Kobuko twice. I had to draw Nar for set 10. A lot of these characters that I don't think that I ever expected to work on, because in my head, I was like, surely I will be working on something that I specialize in. But I think working in a team that is very oriented on fulfilling a need, which is gameplay, you really never know what you're going to be put on next, right? And then sometimes you'll be even on like an item icon, or sometimes I was even thrown into, for example, making Alune. I think the breadth of stuff that I was very fortunate to work on for TFT has taught me a lot about how to adapt and grow and learn how to take inspiration from other people's art styles and other people's perspectives. And I think that was a really big growth point for me as an artist, because I also think that like when you're kind of by yourself and you get to do whatever you want, sometimes that's cool, but like other times, like maybe you're not really learning about what is cool to other people, you know what I mean? And I think that sometimes that's really important to get that empathy for other people's stuff. Because after drawing Kobako twice now, I feel like I can really understand and resonate what players who want to see this character want to see. They want to see somebody who is joyful to like a almost insane amount, right? And he's just having fun and he's just like here to like party or something, you know? And that's what's really important to understand as an artist, is that understanding how to make that art for other people is what I learned on the job the most. And just because I'm an artist, that doesn't mean that my opinion is more valid than anybody else's. And I think that talking to some of the coworkers who are huge fans of Kobako has made me appreciate Kobako more, and made me also feel like even when I'm not doing something that I necessarily like love doing, it's important to someone out there, and that somebody is going to derive a lot of joy from this. I started illustrating for games basically because in high school I was like a huge League of Legends fan. I think I played it a little bit too much. I was like a diamond player in like high school, so I definitely was spending more time playing League of Legends than actually drawing. But I think at one point I looked on like careers.com or something, and I was like, am I able to get a job just like playing League of Legends? And obviously the answer was no. But there was like jobs to like make League of Legends. And so I was like, oh, okay, well, what can I do? And the only thing I knew how to do back in high school was basically, well, to draw. And so I picked up the pen and I was like, you know what I'm gonna do? I'm gonna become an illustrator for League of Legends. And from there, I just went to art college and I was pursuing art as like a main career of mine, and found myself doing different things. I think I originally went for game design because I thought I want to design League of Legends. And then I was like, I don't really want to design League of Legends. I think that's a little bit scary. And so I ended up switching to fine art, and I became interested and like kind of fell in love with the art of just painting and creating images. I eventually moved to fine art as a major, and I started painting a lot more. Started getting to oil painting a lot more, and then I dropped out of college. Funny enough, to freelance for Riot. And what I did was I was doing a lot of stuff. I was doing concept art for skins for a little bit, and then I did some illustrations for some story arts. And eventually I found my way into getting hired here at Riot, and here I am doing what I love every single day. So at this point, I'm kind of feeling like I've gotten a pretty good grasp on what I'm trying to hit here for Alune's crop. And so we're gonna take this and we're going to refine it a little bit more in terms of value. And then we're going to see how the colors work on it and maybe like what we can do with the story here a little bit. So for the sake of this, because we have to expedite the process a little bit, I won't get too much into this portion of it, but I did want to run a little bit of an explanation or thought process on what I'd actually be hitting here besides just posing. Because I think posing is something that I just did and I'm like, okay, great, I feel like good about the posing stuff. But I think a really big important part of our job as illustrators is to tell a story. And I think the storytelling portion of an illustration is actually the more interesting part of it. And sometimes we don't always get the luxury of doing that, but I did want to talk about when we do have a big piece like this, how we can think about composition and storytelling and telling something with these characters. Because now I've solved the problem of her pose, where I'm like, oh, I really want her to do this pose. But now that I've finished that problem, I'm gonna move on to the next problem, which is, okay, the pose is good, what's her story? How does her pose support the story? It's another problem for me to solve. I'm going to dictate a lot of my next problem solving and my next few steps off of that. I think what I'm gonna do now is I'm going to take my sketch here and move it into Photoshop so I can begin a little bit of a lighting test on it and see how I feel about like some lighting scenarios and some different contrast ratios that I can kind of test out. And because we're expediting this a little bit, of course, we're gonna be able to speed through this a little bit faster, but I think primarily in this stage, this is when I would probably ask a lot of like my friends, if I was working with my friends, or if I was working with coworkers, when asking coworkers like, hey, like, you know, like, does this arm look off? Does this like eye look off? Like, what do you think about this? I think that my process is a lot of trying to see what other people might feel about it, and then making a rational decision based on the information that I've gotten from that. For me, working collaboratively is kind of a must when it comes to doing stuff like this. I think I have different opinions, obviously, when it comes to doing personal work and my own stuff that I'm doing indulgently for myself. But when it comes to stuff like this, I think you really don't want to be in your head and be really precious and not look for other opinions and ideas here, because at this stage, literally like anything can happen. And if someone can point out something earlier to you, I think that is more than valuable, like way more valuable than if you just got through more drawing by yourself without any different ideas. What I'm doing here is I'm trying to check for the silhouette here. I'm kind of just filling in this space with just like a darker gray or a darker value here, just to make sure that there's enough contrast to read it. But you can kind of notice that I'm not really staying too close into the drawing here, and I'm trying to like squint at it and see maybe opportunities to maybe push and pull that silhouette a little bit more. So right now, as I'm looking at it, I feel like I'm kind of lacking some sort of like depth in my piece. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna try to figure out some sort of like foreground element here. I'm gonna block it in with like a darker, value here. You know, maybe this is like the hole that she's burning in the building that we saw earlier, you know, or maybe it's just some blades of grass or some sort of tree here or something. But I think that we do want to figure out something here. Maybe it's like the belly of a monster that Alune bore a hole through with like a moon laser, you know? Why not? You know? Maybe we got some of the ribs going here or something. Or is that too graphic? Is that too graphic? So right now I'm just kind of blocking in some background details using very like low contrast brush strokes that are not too different from some of the values that I chose for the background. I can still kind of play around with the real estate as long as I'm kind of keeping in mind that there's this square, this invisible square that's going around her head to her shoulder and then keeping some space to like the left here. So as long as I'm kind of keeping that space here, it should be okay for me to go ahead and like move things anywhere and reorient things. I think it's important not to really stay precious with some of these things, just because at this point in the painting, the more precious that we get with things, the more scared we are to make changes. And I think that right now, like this is where the most changes will happen and the most changes should happen. But when I'm trying to work fast on something like this, I'll use the smudge tool and I'll probably turn it to like maybe 50%. And I'll kind of use this to move elements around a little bit. This is just a faster way of like liquefying. Well, you can use liquefy too. I just like using smudge because it's fast. And there's this effect that it does also where it kind of blurs lines a little bit. And I think that that's something that sometimes people are primarily like against happening, but like for me, I kind of like when that happens because it gives me an opportunity to kind of redefine and like refine what that line is and what it's kind of doing in the context of the entire piece. What I'm trying to do at this stage is to sell the story more so than I am trying to sell the drawing here. But what I'm trying to do here is trying to give people the semblance of like, hey, I'm basically trying to go for this story. Do you think that this is cool for the character, right? And then people will be able to be like, oh, I do think that this is cool for the character. I think that if I get too focused on the drawing aspect, which, you know, I should be a better drawer at this point, but I'm still struggling a little bit here. If we get too focused on those nitty-gritty details, people are going to have a bias towards certain ones versus other ones. And I think right now what we're trying to display as fast as possible is that the idea is here so that people can kind of latch onto the idea first, and then I can solve those problems later. At this stage, even if it's really not drawn well, or if it's not finished well, or not in a good spot, you want to be able to like look at it and see like, okay, I do know what it's going to end up as though. And then kind of formulate an idea of what that is in your head, because what you're doing there is really building confidence in your product. Like you're kind of like thinking to yourself, like, I know what I want out of this. Because I think the dangerous thing that you can get yourself into is not knowing what you want your piece to look like at the very end. And if you don't know what you want your piece to look like at the very end, I don't think anybody else is going to either. Or the worst is that people are going to expect something from you at the very end of the product, but you're not going to know what it is, and then you're going to spend the entire time trying to like see if you can convince people to see what you are seeing. It's a lot of experimenting with what kind of approach you want to do for each one. Like there's never really like one right way to do it, and I think that's always a good thing to keep in mind. You generally won't know what the best approach is, so it's best to just try everything out and then see what sticks for this certain project. It's important to show that you can do the overarching process of thumbnail to green light to render, and show that you can do that. But I think how you do each individual step is up to you and up to whatever you feel is the best approach to maybe showing that skill set. You'll find a lot of times that we as artists are not a one size fits all in like any sort of category. I think that art is so subjective, and art is a lot of times I think we think that art is really objective, but I feel like that's a very sad way of thinking about things all the time. And I think that art is really subjective. And I think that like how we get to certain projects and how we get to certain endpoints is kind of more up to us, as long as we can get there. And I think that's what employers are really looking for, is for us to be able to get there. One thing that I'll always recommend is maintaining joy as you work through something, because I think that if you literally cannot find joy from whatever you are doing, you are eventually just gonna burn yourself out so bad that you're just going to make less art. And I don't think that as artists in any such circumstance, I don't think we should ever be looking to do what makes us make less art in the end, you know? I think for the sake of time here, what I'm doing is I'm just going to pretend like we have other thumbnails to pull from. I'm just drawing out quick sketches, I guess, of like what would work. I would say that, again, it's kind of like the warm-up thing that I said earlier, where the first drawings always kind of be the worst. And I also sometimes feel that with thumbnails as well, where our first thumbnail is never going to be the best one. And I say that because sometimes it is going to be exactly what you expect to get from the piece. Sometimes we'll default to something that's very easy or very normal to do, or something that's just in the range of expectation. And I think that sometimes that isn't always the best one to go for. At the end of it, I'll be like, holy, thank God I did more than one option, because we were able to see so many different ideas for this, and then see through a different choosing selection, and maybe like even through the process of elimination, we'll see what's working, what's not working. And then I'll be able to even make more thumbnails, right? But for the sake of this, we'll kind of pretend like, oh, you know, we have A, B, C, and D here, but we've just ultimately decided that A is the direction that we want to go, and it's like the clearest. And again, while I don't necessarily think that that would be the case in a normal situation, because I'm actually kind of digging the pose of C here, I'm going to just pretend like A is the one that we're going with. And I'm going to start refining that one a little bit more. So from here, I'm thinking I'm actually going to start fixing like a lot of stuff. So a lot of times in here, I actually like to to merge everything into one giant layer and then just nudge things around and be really, again, like anti-precious with my painting here. Because again, I think the more precious that I get with a lot of these ideas and shapes and stuff, the more it'll stop me from making unnecessary change that I'll have to do later on. Because I think that for an illustration, or even a concept, or even just art in general, getting too attached to something can really be sometimes the burden that you kind of have to get rid of as you're working. When we're doing illustrations in particular, we kind of have, I want to say, four gateways, four gate points. And that's where we have to like look at it and then pass it along and be like, okay, now we're ready to go to the next step. So I think that we'll always start at the thumbnail stage, right? Which is the one that we just hit, where we're essentially just trying to grasp the image and story in a really quick read that's very quickly done, sometimes not even drawn well, sometimes just done very roughly. And we're just trying to sell the idea to people so that we can find a direction, right? And then from there, we'll go to green light. And green light is when we take that thumbnail, we refine a lot of that direction and condense that into essentially a point where it's like we don't have the materials down and things may not be painted, but things aren't going to move anymore. Like we're not going to like essentially like move parts very drastically. We're going to just take this and we're going to paint it more until it gets to that League of Legends style or that TFT style where it's just very like materialistic, almost realistic in terms of the painting. And then so that's, I think, when we hit that point where we're not moving anything anymore, that's when we move into the third step, which is render. And then render is going to be where we're like making our metals look metal, we're making our fabrics look like fabric, we're making our hair look like hair. All these things that are essentially just finishing off what we started. And then at the very end, we'll get into polish. And I think polish is when we will add like very like small lighting effects and we'll like, you know, maybe like play with noise here a little bit there, make things look like more like a camera or like play with things. But that's when everything's just pretty much finished. It's important to note that illustration is kind of more of a marathon. There's stuff that you have to do and there's a lot of stuff. It's like a long run, right? There's those moments where you have to really pay attention and really like keep your pace and stuff. And then there's that point where you get so close to the end that you're like, I just need to get to the end now. So I think today we're probably only gonna get through thumbnail and green light, or maybe not even like fully through green light, but we're gonna get as close as we can to that. And I think that that is the more important stuff to think about anyway. Because even green light, I think, because again, this is like, as I've said before, like this is a really expedited version of what I do for work, because the amount of time that it takes to get to the end of green light is usually like 2 weeks or 1.5 weeks of work. And then we're attempting to do all of this within like an hour. Also, a helpful tip for when you're trying to get through these projects a little bit faster than usual, it's good to work as small as possible. Generally, a smaller canvas is always good if you're trying to finish something out really quickly, just because it literally disallows you from being able to do more than you need to, right? If I try to get in here to do like rendering on this hair, like I can literally see each of the pixels like one by one, and it's not going to look very good. And it's going to actually dissuade me so much from actually getting into that kind of stuff. For Alune, there aren't as many iterations with her, so I think it's really important to show, number one, her weapon, and then number two, her headpiece. I think those are two things that she'll pretty much always have on her as a character. And those are the things that I would just prioritize in the silhouette of the character. But I think that when it comes to recognizability, sometimes characters will be really, really reliant on their facial read, on TFT especially, because when it comes to TFT gameplay, you're only seeing their faces primarily for a lot of the game, because the amount of real estate that you get to like really see anything is like, I want to say like a tiny little square, like basically just like their face and a little bit of their weapon, right? And so the silhouette is what matters in as the first read, but then the second read is the face. And so It's really, really important, and we take it pretty seriously to get character likeness straight on when we're making a new character, because we have this opportunity to showcase maybe a character that like players love, and we really don't want to misrepresent what that character looks like. All in all, I think that what's important for a lot of the characters is that we really represent them in the way that they were initially intended to be represented. And a lot of times that's not even decided by us, right? That's decided by people who worked on these characters before us, right? And so if those people are there, I'll probably go ask them. Like for Alune, for example, I think I went and talked to Sunny, who is by the way, the concept artist for Aphelios and Alune. I went to talk to him like literally every week to check in and say like, hey, am I correctly representing this character? Is this what we initially like decided for this character? Is this going against what we really wanted for this character? And I think that those conversations really helped guide me to make sure that like when people see this character, they know it's Alune and they don't think it's Irelia, or they don't think it's Lux, or they don't think it's Ashe, you know? And even in all their different iterations, like their faces should remain the same. And I think that their faces, their posture, how they represent themselves in these worlds should always be consistent throughout all the products. And so that's something that I really try to get right for everything. I have pretty intense feelings about social media right now and the part it plays in everyone's lives and stuff. And I think it was particularly challenging navigating the world as an artist who was trying to get a job, and also being someone who didn't want to be necessarily always online, but like kind of feeling the pressure of posting online to get a little bit of the validation, as well as like with the marketing came with it. And I think that I'm happy with what I used to do. I feel like what got me even noticed by Riot in the first place was a lot of that fan art that I used to do when I was a student. But I also think that I maybe outgrown it a little bit, and I have maybe other things I want to prioritize besides like rotting on line all the time and stuff. I also think I developed a really toxic relationship with my online persona, you know? I started thinking about numbers and like what would probably do big on like the algorithm and all that stuff. And I think that really harmed myself as an artist, because it made me stop creating things that I wanted to create and made me want to create things I thought other people wanted me to create. I think it's hard to navigate like the world as an artist, especially when you're a student. It is nice that you guys are making this though, the Power Hour stuff, because I feel like if I was a student, I would have really, really liked to see this kind of stuff. I think that was one of the hardest things when I was in college, was legitimizing what I do as like an actual job to my parents, you know? Maybe a lot of students can relate, but it felt like I was convincing like my parents that unicorns were real, you know? It's like, no, I can make a living off of drawing pretty girls. And my mom's just like, that doesn't seem real. You just are believing anything that goes on the internet, huh? And I was like, no, I promise, I swear to God. It was funny because I feel like there was still a lot of doubt in my choices for my career, all the way up to the point where I got my job. And then they were like, oh no, we always believed in you. And I think that's always how it is. I don't think games in the current state of where we are right now would really exist without the artwork that we make, because I think that some people really genuinely get into these games for the artwork. I mean, I know that I was one person that did that, and that's why I think it's important for me. We can always work on anything for like as long as we want. I could take 2 years to finish this if I wanted to, right? And just like get into like every single nitty-gritty detail. But I think at one point you should just like call it quits and just be like, I think that this is, at least when it comes to personal art, I'll be like, I think I've gotten all I need for this, and then I'll move on. But for industry art, it's really up to my art director. It's like, hey, when does my art director think it's finished? When the notes stop coming in and you start to feel like the notes that are coming in are starting to like get like kind of reiterated or like redone, you know? They're not really like adding to the piece anymore. I think that's when you kind of figure out like, hey, I think that we should just call it here. But I mean, right now I'm just focusing primarily on the face, because I think that a lot of times the number one thing we'll always get notes on is how the face looks. And it's always good to put some elbow grease into this area, because a lot of times, unfortunately, when we're painting for like other people to eventually see it and get notes from, the face is just such a drawing point that like, even if everything looks beautiful, but the face looks a little bit off, the first note you will always get is on the face and like that you should make it better. And you're like, okay, but like whatever everything else. And they're just like, you know, everything else is fine, but like it's the face. And you won't really get any like actually like really good notes that you can really like work off of. And so I'll always like somewhat work on the face a little bit at the beginning, just to make sure that like we're avoiding that situation where we're kind of not really looking at areas to improve, but we're just looking at the area that like people are noticing the most. But like it's important to realize why like some things are exciting to other people as well, is because like sometimes that inspiration is literally their excitement for that character. And it makes stuff like, you know, drawing Kobako for like the 18th time like exciting, or, you know, drawing, I don't know, Pengu for the 8 millionth time like exciting, you know. Those are the stuff that I feel like I kind of have to be inspired by in order to kind of like do what I do. Otherwise I'd just be burned out all the time, you know. And it'd just be like, well, I never want to paint anything ever again. And I think that if you find that joy in kind of trying to figure out what makes other people happy, I think illustration can be like a job for you. Originally, a fun little story about Alune's concept was Alune was meant to be just Alune. Like she was meant to just be a woman who fires magic missiles from her hand. And I literally looked at that and I was like, I don't want to do that. That sounds boring, right? That's too typical. That's what we think that Alune would do, right? And so a lot of conversations was like, can I do something really like cool or interesting for her? And that's how we stumbled upon like, I had this spread of sketches for Alune where she was using different weapons, or I think I had one even where she had used Aphelios's guns but repurposed them into staffs. But there was one drawing that stood out in particular that was the drawing of Alune sitting on this moon, almost like a swing. And then I feel like when I showed that to everybody, it was like this tiny little drawing on the corner of the page, but everyone was so drawn to it and everyone kind of saw that and they were like, yeah, this is kind of ridiculous, right? This is a crazy idea of a character, right? A character who rides on top of essentially this unicycle, but it's also TFT, so like what the hell, why not? The relationship between concept artists and splash artists on TFT is pretty tight knit because we have on gameplay, I'm speaking specifically from the perspective of gameplay, we have literally 2 concept artists and 1 splash artist. It is pretty close because I think that when we have like a smaller team and we have, you know, less hands to kind of rely on, I think that it's important that we lean on each other for a lot of stuff. And so a lot of what we do is very intertwined. I'll actually be giving feedback when it's in the stage of a concept, but also KK and Danny will also give feedback when it's in the stage of splash. It's like one of those ones where I don't think that it ever hurts to work together. Just checking one more time to make sure they look like the same person. Yeah, great. Here is our in-game crop for Alune in Anima Squad. This was definitely an experience, kind of trying to condense a few weeks into a very, very short amount of time, but I think it was fun overall. Is there things that we can improve? Well, yes, but it turned out fine. Hopefully everyone likes it. Biggest thing that I can say is that growth comes from doing something that you're genuinely passionate about. You should always love what you're doing. And I think that if you don't love what you're doing as an artist, I think that we need to take a step back and really think about why we do this in the first place, because at the end of the day, what we do is silly, so you should just do what you want anyway. Just go paint, I don't know, go draw and do what you like. All the stuff that is a technical skill comes after you start creating what you love. Thanks everyone for tuning in to the Super Art Power Hour. We'll be back for episode 9. I'm gonna go now. Bye.